before the world knew their name, before the thunder was echoed across coasts. The Vikings lived quietly among the fjords and forests of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, lands of icy mountains, fertile river valleys, and deep blue seas, with a cradle of a culture destined to shake the foundations of medieval Europe. The term Viking wasn't originally a people. It was a verb, a word in Old Norse, Vikingr, meaning to raid or plunder. These early Northmen were farmers, fishermen, traders, and sometimes pirates. But they were not yet a united people. They were divided by clans and tribes, by harsh terrain and the lack of central kingship. Yet they were bound by language, belief, and an iron will to survive. Life in early Scandinavia was brutal. Winters were long and merciless. Food had to be fought for, harvested from stubborn land or pulled from the sea. Villages clung to the edges of fjords, built from rough timber, their people hardened by cold and isolation. But from this hardship came strength and innovation. These early societies relied on kinship and honor. Power belonged not to kings, but to chieftains who ruled small regions and answered to no one. Law was spoken, not written, passed down at gatherings known as things, where free men debated justice and resolved disputes. Women held surprising influence, managing farms, owning property, and raising the next generation of warriors. But something was stirring beneath the surface. By the late 700s, changes in environment and economy pushed the Northmen outward. Growing populations strained the land. Wealth from distant shores beckoned, and tales began to travel of undefended monasteries, of rich trade towns, of soft, ripe kingdoms to the south. A shift had begun. A society of isolated clans would become something greater. Their world would expand, not through empire or diplomacy, but through oar, axe, and fire. And so the Viking Age began. In hindsight, historians point to a confluence of forces. The Carolingian Empire, once strong under Charlemagne, had begun to fracture. Trade routes through the Baltic and North Seas were opening. And crucially, the Norse had perfected something that would change history, the longship. But this was more than just opportunism. It was identity. The Norse did not see their actions as conquest, but as expansion. To raid was a form of glory. To die in battle was the road to Valhalla. They were not barbarians, but believers in divine destiny, guided by gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, who demanded courage, cunning, and blood. By the end of the 8th century, the world would no longer see Scandinavia as a frozen backwater. The Northmen were coming. Their sails would darken the horizon. Their stories would echo in legend, song, and fear. And it all began with hunger, honor, and the sea. If the Vikings were born in the harsh lands of Scandinavia, their true home was on the waves. Their most iconic creation, the longship, was not just a vessel. It was a weapon, a symbol, and a marvel of engineering that gave rise to an empire without borders. Longships were the arteries of the Viking world. Sleek, fast, and agile, they were designed for both open-sea voyages and shallow river runs. With their shallow draft, longships could land on any beach, sail far inland, and retreat just as quickly. No port was needed, no roads required. For their enemies, the sea was a barrier. For the Vikings, it was a highway. These ships were built with overlapping planks of oak, clinker-built. The technique was called giving them strength and flexibility. At their core ran a sturdy keel, while symmetrical ends meant the ship could reverse without turning around. A single square sail, woven from wool and sometimes dyed in vivid colors or striped patterns, caught the wind. But in still waters or tight corners, a team of warriors rowed tirelessly with oars, each movement a beat in the pulse of Viking conquest. Construction of a longship was an art. Master shipbuilder, called Skipasmir, knew how to read the grain of the wood, how to balance speed with strength, and how to bend timber without breaking it. Trees weren't just cut. They were chosen, shaped by axe and fire into ribs, planks, and masts. Each ship was unique, and some were revered as almost living things. The longship was not a floating castle, like the galleons of later empires. It had no heavy cannons or towering decks. What it had was mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare. When the curved dragon-headed prow appeared on the horizon, it was often already too late. Monks and villagers across Europe learned to fear the sight, sleek, silent, and suddenly everywhere. With these ships, the Vikings became the masters of mobility. They could raid, trade, explore, and settle. They reached the coasts of Britain and Ireland, sailed down the rivers of France, through the channels of the Low Countries, and even across the Baltic into modern-day Russia. But the longship was more than a tool of war. It was the beating heart of Viking life. Children were told tales aboard them. Warriors prayed to the gods under their sails. Explorers followed stars, an instinct on journeys no one else dared attempt. Even in death, some Viking chieftains were buried in their ships, like the famous Oseberg and Gokstad burials, believing that their vessel would carry them to the afterlife. The design evolved over time. Early warships like the corvette were smaller and broader, suited for close-range coastal raids. Later came the Skade, longer, faster, and built to carry dozens of men across oceans. Some, like the famed Drakkar, bore fierce animal heads and shields along the sides, turning the vessel itself into a symbol of intimidation. And they weren't just for raiding. Some were built for exploration. It was aboard longships that Norsemen discovered Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, what we now know as North America, centuries before Columbus was even born. These ships connected a vast Viking world stretching from the White Sea to the coast of Newfoundland. But above all, the longship gave the Vikings something no other medieval people had: reach. They could vanish as quickly as they arrived. They could strike from the sea, travel inland, and leave before armies could respond. Their mobility made them unpredictable. Their unpredictability made them terrifying. With the longship, the Norse turned geography into strategy and the sea into a battlefield. Even today, their shipbuilding methods remain impressive. Archaeologists continue to marvel at the precision and durability of Viking craftsmanship. Modern replicas have crossed the Atlantic, proving that these were not accidental voyages, but intentional, planned explorations. In many ways, the longship was the first domino in a cascade of history. Without it, there would have been no raids, no settlements, no Viking Age. It was not just wood and sail. It was freedom, power, and possibility. When the world looked out to sea, they saw danger. The Vikings saw destiny. The year was 793 A.D. On the northeast coast of England, the tide rolled in as it always did, brushing against the low shores of Lindisfarne, a small island home to a sacred Christian monastery. It was a place of prayer, isolation, and peace. The monks there lived humbly, transcribing scripture and tending to the spiritual life of the kingdom of Northumbria. But on that fateful summer day, peace died with the morning mist. From the sea came something new, sleek ships cutting through the waves, bearing warriors not of this world. They wore animal skins and iron helmets. They carried axes and shields, not crosses or offerings. They didn't speak Latin or kneel before the altar. And when they landed, they brought fire, steel, and terror. The raid on Lindisfarne marked the beginning of the Viking Age in the eyes of the Christian world. It wasn't the first Norse raid nor the bloodiest, but it was the most symbolic. A holy site had been defiled. Priests were slain, relics stolen, the church desecrated. The spiritual guardians of Anglo-Saxon England were powerless before the fury of the sea-born invaders. To the monks, it was an apocalypse. Chroniclers called it the wrath of God. Immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen in the sky, wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an omen, they believed, of divine punishment. The fear was not just of men, but of a cosmic reckoning. But for the Vikings, this was a beginning. The raid revealed a crucial truth. Europe's wealthy coastlines were vulnerable. Monasteries were rich in silver, gold, and unprotected knowledge. Coastal villages had no armies. Local rulers were often slow to respond. And so, Lindisfarne became a template, a bloody blueprint for how the Northmen would strike over the next 2 centuries. What made Lindisfarne so infamous was not its scale, but its target. In Christian Europe, monasteries were untouchable. They were sacred spaces, immune from political violence that plagued the mainland. The fact that these wild men from the sea had the audacity to attack a house of God was unthinkable and unforgettable. The psychological shockwaves traveled far beyond England. Frankish and Irish chronicles took note. Rulers from Charlemagne to the kings of Wessex began to rethink their defenses, and the Vikings, emboldened, prepared for more. But why Lindisfarne? And why now? The answer lies in proximity and strategy. Lindisfarne was accessible by ship, isolated, and loaded with wealth. The monks there had no weapons, no walls, and no warning. It was the perfect soft target. And it was not alone. Dozens of similar monasteries dotted the British and Irish coasts, all ripe for the picking. In the aftermath, the survivors fled. The relics were moved inland. Walls were built. But it was already too late. The storm had broken, and Lindisfarne was just the first drop of rain. It's important to understand what the raid represented for both sides. For Christian Europe, it was a cosmic violation, a brutal insult to the divine order. The invaders didn't speak the language of diplomacy or religion. They didn't send emissaries or negotiate treaties. They arrived, they took, they burned, and they vanished. For the Norse, it was something else entirely. It was a rite of passage, a claim to glory, a sign that their long ships could take them beyond the horizon and bring them back richer and more powerful. It wasn't blasphemy. It was boldness. The gods of Asgard didn't forbid bloodshed. They demanded it. Over the next few years, more raids followed. Jarrow, Iona, and the Shetlands. The North Sea, once a barrier, had become a highway of plunder. The Norse knew now that the world beyond their fjords was not just survivable. It was conquerable. And Lindisfarne would become a symbol, a bloodstain on the page of history that marked the end of one world and the violent birth of another. Today, the ruins of the monastery still stand, wind-swept and solemn. They serve as a haunting reminder of that morning in 793, when sails appeared on the horizon and everything changed. In that moment, the Viking Age truly began, not in Scandinavia, but on the edge of England, with blood on the sand and fire in the sky. After Lindisfarne, the floodgates opened. The Norse had discovered more than just foreign wealth. They had found a weakness in the defenses of Europe. And with that knowledge, a new breed of warrior emerged. Not just raiders, but conquerors. Men who saw the sea not only as a path to plunder, but as a hunting ground. They moved like wolves, swift and ruthless, striking when least expected. And so the coastlines of the West came to fear a new kind of enemy, wolves on the waves. The coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia became prime targets. In the years that followed, Viking raids became a regular, almost seasonal occurrence. Like the tides, they came and went, sometimes in small bands, sometimes in great fleets. They struck churches, farms, markets, towns. They weren't interested in glory. They wanted silver, gold, slaves, livestock, and terror. England was particularly vulnerable. At the time, it was divided into smaller kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. Each had its own ruler, its own military, and its own political agenda. This fragmentation made it nearly impossible to present a unified defense. Viking raiders exploited this disunity with brutal precision. They struck the east coast with growing frequency, Yorkshire, East Anglia, Kent. In 851, they overwintered for the first time on the Isle of Thanet, no longer content with hit-and-run tactics. That winter changed everything. It was proof that the Vikings could stay. In Ireland, they found a fractured network of rival clans and kings. Viking longships sailed up the rivers Liffey, Shannon, and Boyne, establishing fortified camps known as long forts. These weren't just temporary bases. They were beachheads. From these, they launched inland raids, established trade networks, and eventually founded entire cities, including Dublin. Yes, Dublin, the modern capital of Ireland, was originally a Viking slave market. In Francia, the situation was just as grim. The mighty Carolingian Empire had begun to weaken after Charlemagne's death, and the Seine River became a Viking highway. In 845, a Viking fleet led by the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, or a warlord claiming his name, sailed up the Seine and attacked Paris. The city paid a massive ransom to make them go away, and in paying, they invited more. For the Vikings, raiding wasn't just survival, it was economy. Silver flowed into Scandinavia by the ton. fueling local economies, empowering chieftains, and financing even larger fleets. The Norse didn't use coinage much at home. They weighed silver by the ounce, cutting and melting it as needed. Every monastery sacked, every noble ransomed, every peasant enslaved. It all translated into weighty, glittering success. But there was something more sinister in their approach: unpredictability. They didn't march in columns or follow roads. They came by river, by estuary, by marsh. They appeared in places thought safe. A longship could travel up a river in silence, shielded by forest, then disgorge 24 armed men onto an unsuspecting village before anyone even saw the sail. Some Norse leaders, like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Bjorn Ironside, became notorious for their campaigns. Their names traveled across Europe like curses, synonymous with fire and blood. They didn't just raid, they organized. They built alliances, formed war bands, and negotiated when needed. Some settled, marrying local women, integrating into politics. Others stayed wild, living only for plunder. As the 9th century progressed, Viking ambitions began to evolve. Raids turned into occupations. Camps became towns. Looting turned to taxation. A Viking chieftain could now show up with an army and say, "Pay us not to destroy you." This system, called Danegeld in England, became widespread and costly. What made this wave of Viking activity so effective wasn't just the longship or the sword. It was the mindset. These were not armies of conquest in the traditional sense. They were decentralized, flexible, and utterly fearless. Each band was like a roaming tempest, disconnected from the constraints of nationhood or empire. They lived on the edge of civilization, at home on the water, ready to vanish when the tide turned. No one could predict them, and no one could stop them. In response, coastal communities began to militarize. Watchtowers were built. Beacons were lit. Fortifications rose from ashes. But for many it was too little, too late. The wolves had already tasted blood. By the end of the 9th century, Viking settlements dotted the map. The Danelaw had taken hold in parts of England. Norse communities grew in Ireland, Scotland, and even as far south as Normandy in France. What began as chaos had slowly become control. And yet, the Norse weren't done. They had mastered the western coasts. Now they looked toward the edge of the map, toward new lands, unclaimed and untamed. The sea still called, and the long ships still sailed. While Viking raiders pillaged the cathedrals of England and burned their way through the rivers of Francia, another kind of Norse journey was quietly reshaping the world. Not one of conquest, but of discovery. The Vikings, always restless, had begun looking beyond the edge of the known world, past the jagged coast of the British Isles, into the wild North Atlantic, where storms roared and stars served as compass. It was here that they uncovered new frontiers, lands untouched by empire, cloaked in mystery and waiting to be claimed. Their first leap into the unknown was to Iceland. In the mid-9th century, Norse settlers fleeing the chaos of Norway's chieftain wars stumbled upon a rugged island of volcanoes, waterfalls, and endless horizons. The land was fierce and strange, but it was open, free. There were no kings, no laws imposed from above, just mountains, sheep, and space to build new life. Many of the first Icelandic settlers were not merely explorers. They were exiles, outlawed warriors, political rivals, ambitious farmers. Among them was Ingolf Arnarsson, widely considered the first permanent Norse settler of Iceland. Around 874 A.D., he established a homestead at Reykjavik, which would one day become the modern capital. Iceland became a haven for the independent-minded. It had no central king or ruler, but instead developed a remarkable system of governance. The Althing, one of the world's earliest parliamentary bodies. Every free man had a voice. Laws were memorized and recited. Disputes were settled through debate, or sometimes the sword. But the Norse didn't stop there. To the northwest lay Greenland, an even harsher, icier frontier. Its name was a deception, a cunning piece of propaganda by none other than Eric the Red. Exiled from both Norway and Iceland for murder, Eric set sail in search of a new beginning. Around 985 A.D., he found a vast island of glaciers and fjords. He returned to Iceland boasting of Greenland, hoping to entice settlers with promises of fertility and fortune. And some came. A few hundred Norse families followed Eric back, establishing two main settlements along Greenland's southwest coast. They built turf houses and churches, raised cattle and sheep, and clung to survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. For a time, they flourished. Trade routes opened between Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. Ivory from walrus tusks became their key export, prize in Europe. But the farthest journey, and perhaps the most legendary, came next. Vinland, the land of wine, the land across the sea. According to the saga of the Greenlanders and saga of Eric the Red, it was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who first made landfall in North America around the year 1000 AD, nearly 500 years before Columbus. Sailing west from Greenland, he and his crew encountered strange new shores. They named them Helgeland, likely Baffin Island, Markland, probably Labrador, and finally Vinland, believed by many scholars to be Newfoundland in modern-day Canada. Here, they found wild grapes, fish-rich waters, and forests unlike any in the north. Leif and his men built a settlement at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the first confirmed Norse site in North America. But Vinland was no Eden. The Norse encountered resistance, possibly from the native peoples, referred to in the sagas as Skrælings. Skirmishes broke out. Supplies ran low. The climate was harsher than expected, and after only a few years, the dream of Vinland was abandoned. Still, the fact that they got there at all is astonishing. No maps, no compass, just the stars, their instincts, and their ships. The journey to Vinland remains one of the most daring acts of exploration in medieval history. These were not kings or navigators with fleets. They were farmers, warriors, and outlaws seeking freedom and opportunity beyond the sea. But unlike their raids, these expeditions were about planting routes, not wielding axes. In Iceland, they built society. In Greenland, they endured. In Vinland, they reached the edge of the known world. Why did the settlements in Greenland and Vinland eventually fade? Historians point to a combination of climate change, isolation, dwindling trade, and native resistance. By the 15th century, the Greenland colonies had vanished. The Vinland expedition became myth, but the legacy of Viking exploration endured. They had crossed oceans long before other Europeans dared try. They had mapped coastlines with their eyes and sails. They had imagined a world without borders, and in some cases, found it. Today, Leif Erikson is honored in both America and Europe. Statues of him stand in Boston, Chicago, and Reykjavik. His journey is no longer folklore. It is fact, proven by archaeology and sagas alike. In the saga of the Vikings, this chapter proves they were more than just raiders. They were pioneers, cartographers of the impossible, survivors on the edge of the world. And their next frontier wasn't the west, but to the east, where new rivers, new empires, and new opportunities awaited. While Viking longships terrorized the coast of Western Europe and pushed westward to Iceland and Vinland, a quieter but equally profound expansion was unfolding in the east. Here, instead of burning towns, the Norse built cities. Instead of stealing wealth, they traded it. Instead of leaving chaos behind, they laid the foundation for new kingdoms. This is the story of the Rus and the Viking road to Byzantium. Our story begins in the Baltic Sea, where Swedish Vikings, known as the Varangians, began sailing eastward along the river systems of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Unlike the violent raids of their Danish and Norwegian cousins, the Varangians followed a different path, one carved by commerce and political ambition. Their route was a watery labyrinth, from the Gulf of Finland into Lake Ladoga, then down the Neva River, and through vast inland lakes and tributaries that form a natural highway deep into the Slavic heartlands. With shallow draft longships, they could portage between rivers, bypassing rapids, and even entire watersheds by dragging their ships across land. Along this route, Viking traders and warriors began to encounter and eventually rule over local Slavic and Finnic tribes. They were tall, bearded strangers with iron weapons and strange customs, but also with gold goods and charisma. In time, they were not just feared, they were welcomed, integrated, and even invited to govern. This is where the name Rus enters the historical record. According to the primary chronicle, a medieval Slavic text. Local tribes invited the Varangians to bring order to their warring lands. "Our land is great and rich," the chronicle claims they said, "but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." In response, a Viking leader named Rurik establishes rule around 862 AD in Novgorod. Rurik's successors expanded southward, and by the late 9th century, the Varangians had established control over Kiev, a vital trade hub along the Dnieper River. This gave birth to Kievan Rus, a powerful and culturally blended state that would eventually become the ancestor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Unlike in the West, where Viking influence was often transient and brutal, the Varangians in the East built lasting political structures. They intermarried with local elites, adopted Slavic languages, and transitioned from raiders to rulers. They became princes, diplomats, and merchants. Kiev soon grew wealthy through trade, particularly with one of the richest and most sophisticated empires of the medieval world, Byzantium. The Vikings were mesmerized by Constantinople, or as they called it, Miklagar, the Great City. Towering walls, golden domes, bustling markets, and Christian splendor dazzled Norse travelers who had never seen anything like it. But the Norse didn't just admire from afar, they wanted in. The Dnieper River became a Viking trade artery, flowing south to Black Sea and into the heart of Byzantium. Norse merchants brought furs, honey, amber, and slaves. In return, they received silk, wine, spices, and the rarest of treasures, Byzantine gold. But the relationship wasn't always peaceful. Several times in the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking war fleets attacked Constantinople, testing its defenses. The city withstood them, but only barely. The Byzantines, impressed by the Norse warriors' ferocity and discipline, made a bold decision. They would hire them. This led to the creation of one of the most elite military units of the Byzantine Empire, the Varangian Guard. Composed largely of Scandinavian warriors, the Guard served as the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine Emperor. Sworn to loyalty and fear for their axe-wielding prowess, the Varangians became a symbol of both terror and honor within the palace walls. Many Norsemen served decades in the Guard, returning home with stories of marble palaces, desert campaigns, and vast riches. Some never returned, choosing to live out their days in the imperial splendor of the East. The fusion of Viking and Byzantine worlds left a lasting cultural mark. The Rus adopted Christianity, minted their own coins, and began building cities in stone. By the reign of Prince Vladimir the Great in the late 10th century, Kievan Rus had become a formidable political power with a deep cultural alignment toward Byzantium and the Orthodox Christian world. This eastern expansion complicates the image of Vikings as merely violent marauders. In the East, they were colonizers, administrators, diplomats, and mercenaries. They adapted, absorbed, and sometimes even civilized. By the 11th century, the lines between Norse and Slavic identities had blurred. The Viking blood remained in noble families, in place names, and in traditions, but the age of pure Norse rule was waning. The Rus had become something new, a hybrid civilization, forged by sword and trade, river and empire. In the West, Viking raids were beginning to evolve into occupations and settlements. But it was in the East that the Norse legacy took root in stone and dynasty. Their longships had brought them not just to the gates of kingdoms, but into their very halls, and sometimes onto their thrones. Behind every Viking raid, every longship launch, and every sword drawn in battle, stood an invisible army, gods, myths, and an unshakable belief in the power of fate. The Norse were not simply warriors and wanderers. They were believers, bound by a complex and poetic cosmology that shaped how they lived, ruled, and died. At the heart of Norse belief was the idea of fate, or WIRD. It was not something to be bargained with. It could not be delayed, prayed away, or changed. It was a thread spun by the Norns, mystical weavers of destiny who sat at the roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil, and wove the lives of gods and men alike. For the Norse, to know your fate and to face it boldly was the highest form of honor. This worldview gave birth to a culture obsessed with bravery. A Viking who died in bed was a man cheated by the gods. But to fall in battle, axe in hand, roaring a war cry, that was a gateway to Valhalla, Odin's majestic hall, where fallen warriors feasted and fought forever in glorious afterlife. There, they would prepare for Ragnarok, the end of days, when gods and mortals would unite one final time in a cosmic war. Their gods were not distant, ethereal beings. They were flawed, human-like, and ever-present. Odin, the All-Father, was a god of war, wisdom, and death. He sacrificed his eye for knowledge and hung himself on the world tree to understand the runes. He sent out his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, to fly across the world and return with news. Thor, with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, was a protector of mankind, battling giants and smashing chaos with thunderous blows. He was the people's champion, strong, bold, and loyal. His name lives on our calendar. Thursday, Thor's Day. Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and battle, rode a chariot pulled by cats and chose half of the warriors slain in battle for her own hall, Folkvanger. Alongside Odin, she shared the souls of the brave. The Norse pantheon also included Loki, the trickster god, Freyr, the god of fertility and peace, and countless giants, dwarfs, elves, and spirits that populated their richly imagined universe. These beliefs weren't confined to temples or sacred scrolls. They were alive in every aspect of Viking life. Runes were carved into stones, weapons, and amulets. Oral tales, called sagas and eddas, were passed from skalds, poets, to warriors around roaring fires, preserving history and myth alike. Every storm, every illness, every victory was interpreted as a sign from the gods. Religious rituals were both private and communal. At sacred groves and stone altars called hofs, Vikings made sacrifices of animals, and sometimes humans, to curry favor with their deities. These rituals weren't merely superstition. They were part of the social order, overseen by gwa or priest chieftains, who wielded both spiritual and political power. The Viking warrior culture that emerged from this religious backbone was deeply hierarchical, but surprisingly fluid. Loyalty was paramount. Warriors pledged allegiance to powerful chieftains or kings in exchange for protection, land, and the spoils of war. These chieftains, in turn, relied on reputation and generosity to maintain their followers. A good leader gave gifts, hosted feasts, and led from the front in battle. Weapons were status symbols. A finely crafted sword, often imported or inherited, was more than a tool. It was a legacy, often named and passed down generations. Axes, spears, and shields were common, but elite warriors, berserkers, fought in a frenzy, wearing bear or wolf skins and invoking animal spirits to become immune to pain and fear. Some scholars debate whether berserkers were myth, drug-induced warriors, or psychological phenomena, but in the Viking imagination, they were symbols of unstoppable wrath. Viking warfare was not random violence. It was tactical, mobile, and often governed by a code of honor. Raids were coordinated strikes, quick, targeted, and efficient. Settlements were fortified with longhouses and defended by local militias. When larger armies formed, they marched under banners and boar-crested helms, guided by ravens or dragon motifs as signs of divine blessing. As Viking society grew more complex, the idea of kingship evolved too. Early Viking leaders were warlords, respected for prowess, not bloodline. But over time, particularly by the 10th and 11th centuries, Norse realms began consolidating under formal monarchs, like Harald Fairhair in Norway or Gorm the Old in Denmark. These kings still had to prove themselves in battle, but they now ruled over lands, not just war bands. And yet, even as kingdoms formed and Christianity crept in from the south, Norse beliefs held firm. In stone carvings on runestones and in graves lined with weapons and talismans, the old gods endured. It wasn't until conversion, sometimes voluntary, sometimes enforced, that the great temples of Odin fell silent. But even then, echoes of the old ways lingered. In language, in law, in legend, the gods and kings of the Norse world never truly died. They lived on, immortalized in sagas. And as Viking war bands gathered under the black banners of ravens and dragons, preparing to strike once more, their culture, rooted in myth, fire, and fate, marched with them. By the middle of the 9th century, Viking raids had become a seasonal scourge across Anglo-Saxon England. But in 865 AD, something changed. The ships that landed on the eastern shores of East Anglia didn't vanish after a few weeks. There was no quick strike, no return to Scandinavia with sacks of gold. Instead, an army disembarked, vast, organized, and intent not on plunder, but on conquest. This was no ordinary warband. This was the great heathen army, led by some of the most legendary Viking warriors of all time, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. The army was likely composed of thousands of seasoned fighters from across the Norse world, Danes, Norwegians, and even Swedish warriors united under a shared cause. While estimates vary, it is considered the largest Viking force ever assembled in England. But what made this army different was its objective. Unlike previous Viking groups that came for loot and slaves, the Great Heathen Army came to stay. It was the beginning of Viking colonization, an attempt to carve out a permanent Norse kingdom on Anglo-Saxon soil. The motivations were both strategic and personal. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later sagas, the invasion was partly driven by vengeance. The Northumbrian King Aelle had reportedly captured and executed Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the most fabled Viking heroes, by throwing him into a pit of snakes. His sons, led by Ivar, had come to avenge his death. But vengeance was only the spark. The flame was power. The army began its campaign in East Anglia, where local rulers quickly sued for peace and provided horses to the Norse. This gave the Vikings a terrifying new edge, mobility across land, not just water. From there, they turned north and captured York in 866, one of the richest and most important cities in Anglo-Saxon England. York fell with shocking speed. The local kings, Aelle and Osbert, united to retake it but were defeated. Aelle was captured, and according to legend, executed by the gruesome Blood Eagle ritual, a symbolic and brutal form of Norse vengeance, though historians still debate its historical accuracy. Now in control of Northumbria, the Great Heathen Army established York as their stronghold. The city, renamed Jorvik, became the political and economic center of Viking operations in Britain. Minting coins, organizing settlements, and enforcing Norse law, they were no longer invaders. They were rulers. But the conquest didn't stop there. The army pushed into Mercia, taking the ancient town of Repton, and driving the Mercian king into exile. By the late 860s, nearly every kingdom in England had either fallen or paid tribute, except one, Wessex. Here, the Vikings met their match in a young and determined king, Alfred of Wessex, later known as Alfred the Great. Alfred used cunning diplomacy and guerrilla tactics to resist the Norse advance. After years of back-and-forth warfare, he won a decisive victory at the Battle of Edington in 878, forcing the Viking leader Guthrum to accept peace. The resulting Treaty of Wedmore led to the establishment of the Danelaw, a vast swathe of eastern England under Viking control, but also recognized a boundary with the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Great Heathen Army, now fragmented, began to splinter further. Some warriors settled in the Danelaw, taking land and marrying locals. Others returned to the continent, drawn into Frankish and Irish wars. And some simply vanished, absorbed into the growing Norse-English society they had helped create. But the legacy of their campaign was profound. It marked a moment when Vikings transitioned from raiders to occupiers, from warriors to settlers. Towns like York flourished under their rule. Norse legal traditions, language, and place names seeped into the English landscape. Many still survive today. Words like sky, knife, egg, and window entered English from Old Norse. Villages ending in by, thorpe, and kirk speak to centuries of Viking presence. And the military threat they pose forced the Anglo-Saxons to adapt, to unify, to militarize, and eventually to forge what would become the Kingdom of England under Alfred's successors. The Great Heathen Army, though eventually defeated, changed the political map forever. Their campaign exposed the fragility of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and accelerated the push towards centralization and national identity. Ironically, in trying to destroy England, they helped create it. The Norse dream of empire in England would flicker on in places like Jorvik and the Danelaw, and would re-emerge during the reign of Danish kings like Sweyn Forkbeard and Nut the Great in the 11th century. But the pure, pagan energy of the Great Heathen Army would never rise again. Still, their march through England left deep footprints, in ruins, in language, in law, and in blood. And as one army faded, another transformation began. The Vikings were no longer just enemies of Christendom. They were becoming part of it. By the dawn of the 10th century, the Viking world stood at a crossroads. The age of brutal raids and berserker fury had not ended, but was evolving. The Norse, once feared as a hammer of the heathens, were now weaving themselves into the very fabric of the lands they had once set ablaze. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was slow, complex, and in many ways reluctant. But by the time the century turned, Viking chieftains were no longer just raiders and warlords. They were merchants, kings, and even Christians. At the heart of this evolution was conversion. Christianity had been spreading across Europe for centuries, carried by monks, missionaries, and political pressure. The Vikings at first resisted. Their gods were gods of war, strength, and honor. Odin, Thor, and Frey had seen them through storms, battles, and famines. But as Norse leaders settled in Christian lands and entered into diplomatic alliances, conversion became less about belief and more about survival. The first cracks in the pagan wall came with treaties like the Treaty of Wedmore, when King Alfred the Great demanded that the Viking leader Guthrum convert to Christianity as part of a peace deal. Guthrum agreed, was baptized, and even took a Christian name, Athelstan. It wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Christianity was a language of diplomacy and legitimacy in Europe. To be taken seriously as a ruler, you had to kneel at the cross. Gradually, other Norse leaders followed. Harald Bluetooth, King of Denmark, famously converted in the late 10th century. According to the Jelling stones, massive runic monuments, still standing today, Harald made the Danes Christian. Whether out of conviction or political necessity, the move brought Denmark into alignment with the rest of Christian Europe. Norway, too, began its slow turn. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later St. Olaf, used both persuasion and force to spread the new faith. Pagan temples were destroyed. Crosses replaced Thor's hammers. And those who resisted often met the sword. The conversion of Iceland in 1000 AD was unique. Facing pressure from both Norway and internal division, Icelandic leaders made a pragmatic decision. Rather than plunge the island into civil war, they voted at the Althing, the island's parliament, to adopt Christianity as the official religion. Paganism could still be practiced in private, but the cross would now crown the island's laws and rituals. As the Norse embraced the cross, they didn't abandon their seafaring spirit. They redirected it. Trade replaced pillage. Ports once known for exporting slaves and silver now bustled with merchants selling furs, fish, iron, amber, and walrus ivory. Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, and Jorvik in England became vibrant trade hubs, linking Scandinavia to the wider medieval world. Viking merchants traveled to Byzantium, Baghdad, and even Central Asia. Arabic coins flowed into Norse markets, and silk and spices returned on long, dangerous routes. This global reach reshaped Viking society. Contact with other cultures brought new technologies, fashions, and ideas. Norse art evolved from stark geometric runes to include Christian motifs and intricate animal styles. Law codes were written down. Kings issued coins bearing Christian symbols. And with trade came settlement. In places like the Danelaw in England, Norse families began to intermarry with Anglo-Saxons. Their languages blended. Their customs merged. Town names, farming practices, and even local governance began to reflect both Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions. This cultural fusion also occurred in Normandy, where the Viking leader Rollo accepted land from the Frankish King Charles the Simple in 911 AD. In exchange, Rollo swore loyalty, converted to Christianity, and became the first Duke of Normandy. His descendants would go on to shape European history, most notably William the Conqueror, who in 1066 led the Norman conquest of England. By this time, the lines between Viking and European had blurred. Norse kings now ruled with royal seals, Christian clergy, and written laws. The fearsome dragon-headed ships still sailed, but now under banners of state, not plunder. And yet, the old identity never fully vanished. In the hearts of the people, in the sagas recited around winter fires, the tales of Odin, Thor, and the heroic age of raiding lived on. The Viking spirit, though domesticated, remained proud and alive. The journey from raider to ruler, from pagan to Christian, from outlaw to noble, was one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval history. It was not without violence or contradiction, but it was real. The world had changed. And so had the Vikings. One final storm remained on the horizon, one that would close the Viking Age and leave behind a legacy etched in both blood and stone. The Viking Age did not end with a single battle or final death or a fading torch on a fjord. Like the tides they mastered, it ebbed away, slowly, relentlessly, until what was once feared across continents became memory, legend, and finally, history. By the mid-11th century, the Norse world was changing rapidly. The kingdoms of Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, had consolidated power under Christian monarchs. The wild, decentralized world of chieftains and raiders was giving way to bureaucracies, churches, and castles. Pagan temples were replaced by stone cathedrals. Runes gave way to Latin script. Kings issued charters and treaties instead of raiding orders. But one last ember of the old age still burned. In 1066 AD, the year that changed the fate of England forever, the Viking world made its final, thunderous roar. The spark came from Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, one of Varangian Guard, a Byzantine general, and perhaps the last great Viking warrior king. Hardened by years of warfare across Europe and the Middle East, Harald sought to claim the English throne after the death of Edward the Confessor. But he was not alone in his ambition. Harold Godwin's son, the English king, faced multiple threats. From the south came William of Normandy, himself a descendant of Vikings. From the north, Harald Hardrada landed near York with a fleet of over 300 ships and a vast army. With him was Tostig, Harold's own exiled brother, hungry for vengeance. On September 20th, 1066, Harold's forces crushed the Northumbrian earls at the Battle of Fulford. The city of York surrendered. Victory seemed within reach. But fate turned quickly. Just 5 days later, Harold Godwin's son led a forced march north and met the Norse at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Vikings, unarmored and unprepared, were taken by surprise. What followed was a brutal, day-long clash. Despite legendary resistance, including tales of a lone berserker holding the bridge against the entire English army, the Norse were overwhelmed. Harald Hardrada was killed by an arrow to the throat. Tostig fell beside him. The Norwegian army was annihilated. Of the hundreds of ships that brought them, only a few dozen returned. It was the last great Viking invasion of England, and it failed. Ironically, just weeks later, Harold Godwin's son himself would fall at the Battle of Hastings, slain by William the Conqueror, whose own bloodline traced back to Rollo and the Viking Duchy of Normandy. Thus, the Viking Age ended as it began, by reshaping kingdoms, redrawing maps, and echoing through history. But its ending wasn't just about battles lost or kings dead. The transformation had already happened. By the time Hardrada fell, the Norse world had changed forever. The longships, once the terror of the seas, now serve in trade fleets and royal navies. The sagas, once oral tales of heroism, were beginning to be written down, preserving a cultural identity even as political power faded. The gods of Asgard had given way to the god of Rome, but not entirely. Symbols like Thor's hammer were still worn, now alongside crosses, as silent act of resistance or remembrance. In Iceland, poets recorded the myths of Odin and Loki, Ragnarok and Valhalla. In Norway and Denmark, new dynasties emerged that would go on to shape northern Europe for centuries. Sweden turned eastward, building trade empires around the Baltic and founding cities like Novgorod and Kiev. And perhaps most remarkably, the Viking legacy endured not through destruction, but through integration. The English language absorbed Norse words: sky, window, husband, law. Place names across England and Ireland still echo with Viking origins. Grimsby, Derby, Scunthorpe. Norman rulers, descended from Vikings, would reshape Europe, from England to Sicily to the Holy Land. Even in the New World, Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland survived in legend until its archaeological proof emerged centuries later. The first Europeans to touch North America were not Catholic explorers or Spanish conquistadors, but Norsemen, guided by starlight and storms. The Viking Age, officially spanning from 793 to 1066 AD, may have lasted less than 3 centuries, but its impact stretches far beyond. They were not just destroyers. They were builders. Not just warriors, but explorers, traders, poets, and kings. Not just pagans, But eventually Christians, reformers, and unifiers, they reshaped the map of Europe. They forced kingdoms to unify. They opened trade routes from the Arctic to Byzantium, from the Baltic to Baghdad. They crossed oceans and continents, chasing silver, land, and glory. And though their dragon-proud ships no longer sail, the wake they left behind still ripples through time. They were the Vikings, and their rise changed the world forever. If you love this journey through Viking history, don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and tap the bell for more epic historical sagas from the Crit Stories. Leave a comment. Which Viking story do you want next?